Welcome, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's an honor. My name is Maria Teresa Ferretti. For those of you who don't know me, I'm one of the co-founders and the Chief Scientific Officer of the Women's Brain Project. And together here with me from the WBP team, there's also Anne-Marie Schumacher-Diemer, who's also a co-founder and currently president of the organization. So today we're going to be talking about one of the biggest achievements of the Women's Brain Project as a team, and a huge achievement, I think, for the field. Thanks to the contribution of a lot of people, and some of the amazing contributors are with us today. So I'm extremely proud and happy. I prepared a couple of slides and I'm gonna see if I manage to share them to introduce. Of course, now I don't see them here. Wait, I'm gonna share the desktop and then open the PowerPoint. Can you confirm that you see my slides? Good, excellent. So yes, we're going to be talking about the book entitled Sex and Gender Differences in Alzheimer's Disease, which we have published together with Elsevier in 2021. So I would like to first introduce the book and tell you something about how this book came to exist and the story behind it and the people involved in the book. This is the book, and actually I do have it here. You voila. It's actually a very beautiful resource for everybody. I found this over 400 pages with over 60 authors from 15 countries. We divided it in 3 sections and there are overall 16 chapters. So how did this book start, really? And the story is that Women's Brain Project had started its activities in 2016. And back then, to be honest with you, when a journalist asked me about sex and gender differences in Alzheimer's disease, I had very little to say. You know, I knew that 2/3 of patients were women, but I didn't really know much more about it. And that's where we started to work with the Women's Brain Project. And since then, there has been an explosion of research and findings in this field. And we are actually very proud at the Women's Brain Project, and we think that part of this is also due to our efforts in really, you know, putting this topic there and asking researchers involving and pushing the field a little bit forward. So 5 years later, there has been really, you know, this amazing growth and all this evidence. And so one day we received an email of from the Elsevier team saying, how about we would like to invite you to write a book about sex and gender differences in Alzheimer's disease. We're going to be doing this together. We will help you in the process. You can, you know, invite all the authors. You're free to organize the book as you wish. And I shared the email with Anne-Marie and Antonella Santuccio-Nechada, who's the other co-founder of the Women's Brain Project. And I said, you know, this is like a dream. This sounds too good to be true. But actually, yes. We decided to embark on this and to gather all the evidence that we had until this point, to create a resource that would be useful for people interested in this field and for everybody interested in Alzheimer's in general. So, of course, I highly recommend you to have a look. There are actually, there was so much to talk about in this book that we realized one book was not enough. And we actually agreed with the Elsevier to have a series of books. And the next book in the series will be talking about sex and gender bias in technology and artificial intelligence. So this was supposed to be a chapter in our book, and then we realized it was just impossible to cover everything. And we started a new book. This is coming out in December. So I suggest you to check it out because it's also very interesting, the first ever book to talk about this. In the book we are talking about today, the sex and gender differences in Alzheimer's disease, there are a couple of mentions that I wanted to make. The first one is that we dedicated this book to Sofia Pettersson, who is a person living with familial Alzheimer's disease in Sweden. She has joined the WBP group very early on in 2016. We have become friends. She has joined every single forum and event that we have organized. And she's really an inspiration for us, and we thought it was really important to dedicate all this work to a person like Sofia, to our Sofia. And the other thing is that the book comes with a foreword by Dr. Lukas Engelberger, who is the head of the public health department at the Canton of Basel, Switzerland. So we are also very honored to have this there. How is the book structured? I told you it's over 400 pages, and we divided it in 3 parts. The first section deals with sex differences in fundamental neurobiological processes, And so processes that might be relevant to Alzheimer's disease. There's a lot of, there are chapters on basically animal models and again, fundamental neurobiological processes. And today we have one of the authors of this section that, that will tell us something exciting that comes in this section. We have then section 2, which was focused on clinical aspects of Alzheimer's disease. And here we are looking at symptoms, manifestations, clinical trials, anything related to clinical practice. And again, we have a speaker today. And finally, in section 3, we wanted to make sure we covered also gender, so more socioeconomic, sociocultural aspects related to Alzheimer's disease with a particular focus on socioeconomic factors. And I just want to highlight, I think this is important to say, because we have, since our inception, we have been looking at the issue of sex and gender differences in Alzheimer's disease in a very holistic way. We try to look at all the different levels, from animal models to policy changes. And this is one of the strengths of our group. And this is also the way we have built our work. And so at this point, I'll stop talking and I'll let Anne-Marie introduce you to the Women's Brain Project, actually what we do.
Thank you, Maria Teresa, and good morning. Good evening, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are. So just a brief introduction about Women's Brain Project, what we are, who we are, what we do, if you still haven't heard about us. So next slide, please. So as Maria Teresa mentioned, we have a very clear purpose, a very clear aim, and that is to understand how sex and gender influence and have an impact on both our brain health as well as our mental health. So we look at brain diseases, neurological diseases, as well as psychological disorders, mental health, mental illness. And we do this with the aim of improving healthcare in general, the different aspects of healthcare, as we mentioned, starting from, the basic science, how we conduct experiments, how we conduct and plan clinical trials, how we construct diagnostic instruments, prevention strategies, policy. And we see this as the efficient, effective and sustainable approach, the precision medicine approach, to provide the best healthcare for everyone, regardless of sex and gender. So we do our best to address this sex and gender topic when it comes to different aspects of medicine and healthcare. The outcomes we aim for and we look at are the following, the ones you can see on your screen. So we want the drug efficacy to improve, and we believe it can be improved if sex and gender differences are considered during the whole process, to improve drug safety profiles as well as increase compliance. So when we also look at the socioeconomic aspects, for example, we can also increase or improve this aspect. And with this, apart from making drugs more effective, it also reduces costs. Drugs are more effective. There is less risk of having drugs withdrawn from the market due to unforeseen side effects, for example, as we have already seen with various pharmacological treatments. So we think it's a win-win situation if we consider sex and gender differences. And from here we move from what we call, or what is called, shallow medicine to precision medicine, where we would consider sex and gender characteristics when developing drugs as well as providing healthcare services. What we do, this is a picture, a little bit of what we do. So we considering that most of the team works on a pro bono basis, I always think it's an amazing team effort that we have achieved so much. So we have published a lot of scientific papers, 2 books, one of which is the one we will be talking about today, policy reports. We also organize events. Perhaps many of you have even attended our International Forum on Women's Brain and Mental Health. This year and next year, we are taking part in the Emozioni Forum, which is an itinerant forum that will be visiting various cities in Europe. And we also teach in various events, both at university level as well as within organizations where we are invited to organize workshops or webinars or other types of courses. We have started a regulatory roundtable on women's health and precision medicine, 2 of which have already taken place, and we are planning the 3rd one. And a campaign that has been online, quite present online in this last year, is the Be Brain Powerful awareness campaign. So we are keeping very busy, and we will continue doing so.
Is it possible?
Sorry?
Okay. So while we recover the connection from
Hello? Maria Teresa, can you hear me?
But
can you hear me?
Here you are. Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize. I apologize for the shaky connection. So yes, that was just a little bit about us. And now I'm very, very happy to introduce the speakers taking part today here online with us. We have Lisa Galia, Stefania Ilinsa, and Wendy Widener. Wendy Widener is Research and Policy Project Lead at Alzheimer's Disease International. Lisa Galia is a distinguished university professor within the Department of Psychology of the University of British Columbia. And last but not least, Stefania Ilinsa is a researcher at European Center for Social Welfare Policy and Research in Vienna, and is also a Senior Atlantic Fellow for Equity in Brain Health. Welcome, and thank you for joining us. And and I can see Nancy Foldy has joined us online. Sorry about that. Nancy is a professor at the Neuropsychology Laboratory of Aging and Dementia at the City University of New York. Welcome everyone. And for the first part of this discussion, I'll hand over the moderation to Maria Teresa. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Anne-Marie, and welcome to Nancy. Very happy to see you here, just in time, Nancy. Perfect timing. So let me start with some questions to the authors that we have here. Of course, we would have liked to be able to invite all the authors, but it's really an army, so that's not possible. And even with every single author we have here present today, we could be spending like 3 hours to talk about their own specific topic. So I know we are not making justice to your contribution and to the whole work that is behind it, but still we would like to hear from you. What are really for you the 3 most important take-home messages that you would like people to take from the chapter that you actually wrote in the book? And I would like to go in the order of the book, so starting with the section 1 from the sex differences at the neurobiological levels, and invite Lisa to give us to start giving us the take-home messages from her point of view.
Okay, first I just want to say a big congratulations to the Women's Brain Project team, because that was really awe-inspiring, your introduction, to see all that you have done, and it's just so important, this topic. And I need to also just thank the co-authors of the chapter that we wrote, 2 amazing graduate students, Bonnie Lee and Tom B. Puri, who really did a lot of the work for this particular chapter. and they're amazing, and they're going to be superstars, so watch out for them in the future. So yeah, our chapter was in the original part, which we're talking more about animal models and how that might inform on human disease. And I would say the sort of three main takeaways are that we do talk a lot about sex differences, but sex differences isn't one thing. There are many types of sex differences. And we talk a little bit, we begin the chapter by talking a little bit about that. We then talk about how the hippocampus is one of the first structures that's affected by Alzheimer's disease. And we talk about the many sex differences that we see, both just in a what we call basal format, so in a non-disease state, but we also talk about how sex differences can develop once disease is there. And so we talk about some of the Alzheimer's disease models that are out there in terms of mouse models and rat models, and how then you can see some sex differences as well. We see some hormonal differences. So one of the biggest things that we talk about is neuroplasticity. Neurogenesis exists in the hippocampus. That's just the birth of new brain cells. And we talk about how you see these basal differences, but you also see it following in our disease models. And we talk about how androgens enhance neurogenesis in males, and estrogens can enhance neurogenesis in females. You actually see a nice sex difference there in terms of how hormones are affecting disease neuropathology. And the last thing I'll say is that when we were surveying the literature, and there have been studies done on this in terms of neuroscience, we don't see that many. There is an increase in studies that are looking at sex differences, but we don't see that many studies out there. It's only about, when you actually do a good survey of the literature, it's only about 6% of the studies that are actually analyzing by sex. They might use both males and females, but they don't actually analyze by sex. And I think that's a nice wake-up call at the end to show, hey, we see a number of sex differences in neuroplasticity. We see them in animal models, some animal models, not all of them, see it in human disease. And so we need more research on this topic. I guess I'll end there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Lisa. And I'll move now to the second section, the one that was focused on clinical differences. And I'll invite Nancy to give us the three main take-home messages of her chapter. And maybe you can actually mention the title of your chapter or the topic. I forgot to do that for Lisa, which was neurogenesis and plasticity in the hippocampus. Yeah. So Nancy, the floor is yours. And I think you have to unmute yourself. Yes.
The most common word in all languages across the world is "you are on mute." So again, I concur with Lisa's lovely, but it's just such an honor to be part of this incredible work, and I also congratulate all of you. And it was also giving me and also younger students and graduate students a chance to participate. And also, it was a good, I think the issue of sex differences and sex and gender differences in cognition, of course, it has an incredible history in the development, because we've always had differences in psychology on tests between boys and girls. But interestingly, we do not have it throughout life. You get adult and everything gets jumped together. And that difference, to me, is now a place that we can add to. And if nothing, this chapter, I think, helps to sort of beg the issue to really make sure that what we do is have sex differences in midlife and, very importantly, in late life. I mean, the whole difference in development and early development and later development, we're looking at aging, and I've been a developmental psychologist throughout. And so what I tried to do in this chapter was really bring home how important it is. You just can't look at language, you just can't look at memory, is that you really have to put it in the context of lifespan, and then put it in the context of sex gender differences as well. And that is a new way, and I think a very important way for neuropsychologists to move forward. What we did in the chapter was to look specifically at many aspects, including the structure and physiology and connectivity of the underlying neural network for three areas, particularly in memory. Obviously, we know memory. Very near and dear to my heart are the issues of language and then also executive functioning. One of the things we certainly know is, so my first point, take-home point is, how to measure it and what are the sex differences and what are these norms that we should be achieving. And then the area of memory, of course, is that we know that there are very specific domains in cognitive function in memory, that the issue is also the difficulty during acquisition, and that is the acquisition of learning different in men and women, the rate of learning, the time it takes to learn, and importantly, the ability to retrieve later on once something is learned. So we discussed that aspect of both the learning, acquisition, maintenance, and then retrieval of memory. One of the things I would, of course, love to do when all chapters do is like, oh, we need to do this experiment because if this isn't done, and we need to do this experiment. So that's always a great thing to do when we have a chapter. The next issue was language. And one of the things that I have been saying for, and I can say my age enough, 40 years of seeing patients with Alzheimer's disease and all the dementias, and the fact that I came out of the Aphasia Research Center from the Boston VA back in the 70s, and to do that, is that language plays an enormous part in this. And if we don't look at language, and I think a lot of us now are, much more now recently, even in the past 7 to 10 years, that we need to do that in order to look at what is the semantic difference. Alzheimer's disease is not a phonological and not a syntactic difference, but absolutely a semantic difference. And that merging of when is it memory and when is it a semantic recall is the key to what we need to be looking at. This is the area in the structural areas, in the temporal regions, in the connectivity regions of why that is not kicking in. And there's many, many authors that we've referenced here in the chapter who this is the place we need to look, and that there's wonderful research saying this is way before, this occurs way before any clinical phenomenon happens. I think the research, this pushes us to make the research, to have good measures of what we are then linking to biological and neurological measures and fluid measures, from everything else. But it's our job as neuropsychologists to know what to measure. And so what we propose here in the chapter is really the what to measure in language is the answer there, and the message really is semantics. So those are the 3 points of that I really think are very important, which is, the field in general, what to measure, how to measure it, and then the last thing, of course, is then when to measure it. And my point is that it has to become very early. There's no reason we should be waiting for people to be complaining, even of MCI. There are things going on in the brain way before. That's the place where treatment is going to be effective. That's the place where we need to help people. And the differences that we're looking in gender and sex differences are enormous. And if we miss that, we are just like completely missing the story. So it was extraordinarily exciting to do this chapter and really put for me on the map, we've done it in childhood. Why are we waiting? And what do we need to do to make sure that we change the way that we measure neurocognitive, neuropsychological changes?
Perfect. Thank you so much, Nancy. And now I'll pass the word to Wendy Widener, I think, or to Stefania Linka. What do you prefer? Stefania?
Sure.
Yeah, okay. Sorry.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you very much, Maria Teresa and Anne-Marie, for the introduction, but even more for inviting me to be part of this amazing group of authors. And it really is an endless source of pride to be associated with your work and with your efforts. I hope this collaboration continues for a very long time still. And I also want to start by acknowledging that this chapter I will be talking about has been co-authored with Elina Suzuki from the OECD, who's not here with us today. And maybe to give you just a little bit of background. So we started working on the chapter with the clear understanding that there are gender differences in the prevalence of Alzheimer's disease and dementia. They are large. But we also started somewhat unsatisfied by the explanation that's often offered for this trend, and that is the survival advantage of women. So we tried to the best of our ability to summarize the growing evidence for a complementary explanation, that there are pervasive inequalities in risk factors which place women and other population groups at increased risk of AD and dementia. And I think we have managed to do that. The body of evidence is quite convincing and quite impressive. And this is, of course, worrisome, but we feel it should also be a strong motivator for everyone in this community, because all the risk factors we discuss are modifiable. Therefore, by uncovering and better understanding the inequalities that exist, we are actively charting a pathway for more effective prevention strategies. At least that's the hope, something that we can act on. Another key message that we try to bring in the chapter is that gender and socioeconomic inequality intersect. Now, this means we really need to think beyond additive effects. We need to start exploring complex patterns of interaction. And one good example is that women are more likely to have lower socioeconomic status, a risk factor in itself, but they are also systematically more vulnerable to the detrimental impact of low socioeconomic status on health outcomes. Yeah, so this really should highlight for everyone the vulnerability to adverse health outcomes of the groups that find themselves at the intersection of gender, low socioeconomic status, and other sources of disadvantage. That's, again, a great source for prevention and for focus for prevention and intervention strategies. And finally, I think our results show that a successful prevention strategy must be a population health approach oriented strategy and must build on reducing inequalities in risk factors, as well as inequalities in access to treatment and care. But this really depends on the ability of countries to reduce gender and socioeconomic inequality more generally. Because while some facets of inequality in health and access to care that we identify can be improved through sustained action in health systems and maybe through preventive health programs, the majority of the differences we see and we describe have very deep roots that must really be addressed through a society-wide approach. To what extent this is encouraging for this community, I don't know, but I think it's worth to mention that what we're advocating here is strong prevention strategies, but really rooted in a society-wide approach to reducing gender and socioeconomic inequality more generally. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Stefania. Absolutely agree. And now, last but not least, our Wendy. The 3 take-home messages of your of your chapter. And I'm muting. Yes, perfect.
You know, it's been such a pleasure to listen to these co-authors and to read through the chapters again. Actually, I feel like I learn so much every time I revisit this book, and that's the amazing thing. So thank you to the Women's Brain Project for inviting us, ADI, to be involved in it. And also to acknowledge, as we all have, my co-authors, Paolo Barberino and Chris Lynch, who also helped on this chapter. And, you know, we came at it, you know, last chapter of the book, it really was about, you know, how do we look at this globally in a policy context? You know, what does all of this mean? So these 3 great sections that you just outlined earlier in the presentation. And so we tried to sort of pull back and look at the big picture and sort of see, you know, where are we with all of this? How the heck did we get here? And actually, what do we do with it now that we see all of this inequality? And so what we ended up seeing was that there's this huge imbalance when it comes to women and aging and dementia. And the imbalance is really against women in a lot of ways. And so what we wanted to really pull out, I think, for this talk today is 3 key areas. And what we thought was, you know, lack of access to data, good data on women, and that we really need to, if we're going to understand more, we have to count things. And also, you know, looking at dementia policies, what can we do to change them, to transform them, and to make them more equitable? And lastly, I think for us, we really wanted to focus on leadership, female leadership, and encouraging more of that. So if we talk about data, just briefly, you know, it was really interesting to research the chapter and to sort of look at what a sort of implicitly male biased society we live in, you know, down to the emojis on our phone, you know, all look like male characters. It's just things that we don't even realize. But actually, one of the things that we looked at was a report that was done by Data 2X that was looking at, you know, the Sustainable Development Goals and how, you know, women over the age of 49, we're not really counting a lot of their health impact that's happening to them in the Sustainable Development Goals. And if we're not looking at women who are over, sort of childbearing age, we're not looking at, as they sort of start to go into those vulnerable parts of their life and health and mental health parts of their life as their hormones change and all of this. And if we're not counting women, if we're not looking at them, we can't give them they become invisible. We're not able to sort of create policies around and monitor their well-being. So that was one thing that we noticed, that we really need better gender data, all the way from, Lisa, your point about, sort of basic science, and Nancy, your whole thing that you talked about. I was fascinated by your chapter and what we can do about diagnosis and the social and economic inequalities that Stefania mentioned. If we're not counting this stuff, we have to count it all across the whole life cycle and all across all the domains. About dementia policy, we really wanted to sort of we realized there's no sort of magic bullet, there's not one solution, that we have to take a sort of top-down approach and a bottom-up approach. And the top-down approach, we sort of felt like, we have the Global Action Plan on Dementia. Every single member state in WHO has signed up to it. They've said we're going to have a dementia plan in our country. What a better way, in all those 7 action areas that look at research, that look at diagnosis, that look at care, and all of these things, what a better framework to use to have a sort of transformational way that we're looking at gender. And, the WHO itself sets up sort of its own view about what is gender sensitive, what is gender biased, what is gender transformative. And they themselves sort of say that, gender transformative policy is about really zeroing in on those causes of inequality and coming up with really tangible things that you're going to do about it so you can rebalance it. And so that's what we were saying in our chapter, was actually, how can we use those 7 action areas to really look and come up with really tangible things? How can we encourage governments? This is the bottom up bit. How can civil society come in then and hold governments to account and encourage them actually to implement some of this and to put money behind it? So that's the sort of dementia policy bit. And finally, the female leadership. I mean, what an example do we have right here, what women can do when they pull together. One of the things that really surprised me was as we were researching this, that actually the World Economic Forum did a study where they looked across 153 different countries, and they found that, let me look at my notes here, that only 25% of parliamentary seats had women, and we know possibly from the own work that we're doing in this chapter, the chapters that we wrote, that 70% of global healthcare is done by women, yet only 25% of the leaders in healthcare are women. So, there's no leadership driving it for the role that women are doing the most of. And so what we're calling for is really, enabling more female leadership, because a lot of the research that we saw showed that when women are in those positions, they really do transformational change. They're really good at building coalitions and, driving health agendas and also pulling up their coworkers and mentoring. So this goes back to the point that we made earlier, I think, that, we have to, and I think, Stefania, it was in your chapter, that young girls and women really do, as a risk reduction, need to stay in education. And we need to make sure, as a risk reduction, but also thinking to the future for leadership, that we need to keep women in education so they can become those leaders of the future. So those were our 3 areas. That's the chapter. Thanks.
Fantastic, Wendy. Thank you so much. And you already started to introduce some of the topics I would like to develop in the second round of questions. And I'm going to ask you the question that I get quite a lot. And I have to tell you, at the beginning, when we started with sex differences in Alzheimer's, the first reaction I would get was, there are no sex differences in Alzheimer's. That's, there's nothing. Just forget it. And then we insisted. And now people are starting to give in, to say, okay, there are some differences there. But then so what? I do get this question of the so what very often. And I think it's an important one to address. Because we have to make it clear for people out there that this is not a niche topic. This is not the interest of just a subset of researchers that have their own little passion about something, but that these are fundamental issues in the structural way we do research at the basic level, at the clinical level, and then we build policies. So I would really like to hear from you, really, when we proposed you to participate to this book, I'm sure you had your own point of view on this. You did have this so what part. You knew that this would be contributing to the field. So I would like to hear from you, how do you think these sex differences that you have described in your chapters from different points of view, how important are they? How can they apply and be of relevance to everybody out there, even people who are not working on sex differences? And in any order, whoever wants to jump in, as you wish.
I'll jump in first.
Nancy, go.
That is near and dear to my heart. When I heard that there are more men than women getting diagnosed with MCI, but more women than men getting diagnosed with AD, something's wrong. There's something wrong. And unfortunately, what it is that we're missing and we're not accurately diagnosing the women early on in the disease because of many different reasons. I'm wearing the hat here of the neuropsychologist and how we measure this. And it's very important that we do have, number one, that we have different norms, but also that we now have to think about how we ask the questions very differently. Why are we not measuring it correctly? Maybe that the woman's brain is very different. And to do a certain task, which one part of the brain with Alzheimer's, plaques and tangles is already having a problem, that there might be other areas in the brain that can circumvent and still recruit in order to get the question correct. So it doesn't mean that they don't have the pathology. It may be that the distribution of cognitive function in women is larger, and therefore we might be able to recruit. We don't know if we recruit areas, even we don't have quite enough evidence for some of it, or do we recruit it only when there's a problem? And then, I'm going to go and figure a different way to answer that question. And this happens in the memory and also in the language areas. We just have to come up with different ways to get that. And that was one thing that really upset me, is that, my goodness, we're missing the period during which treatment, care, understanding, your whole evidence of everything that you have to do during day, safety, during the early stages. And you don't just want to hit it at the end of the stage. Mm-hmm. So that to me was, okay, we have a sex difference here that we really have to do something about. And that involves a lot of changes in the neurologic and physiologic area, which is, we might have to look at different areas to see at what point, where is the pathology? Is it a connectivity issue? And linking together the cognition and the underlying brain structures that are changing as a function of disease.
Yes, I absolutely agree. For me, the diagnosis piece is one of the most exciting and important one. Thank you so much, Nancy. Do we have any other burning? Yes, Lisa.
I don't know if it's burning, but I just thought it's good to go from that reductionist to, but I also, Nancy, when I first heard that, I also was really kind of shocked, the MCI versus Alzheimer's difference. But I think the thing I wanted to mention was, we know already that there are some functional connectivity differences, even in terms of neurogenesis that I talked about. If you look at just like one time point, you won't see a sex difference, but we did a very deep dive into, how do they get there? You see huge sex differences. So males, those cells mature more faster than female cells do. And there's actually a big attrition. You don't see that in the female cells. And that suggested to us that you need this different perturbation. Different things would perturbate those new neurons between the sexes, and there'd be different timing that you'd need to use to, enhance or neurogenesis, if that's what your ultimate goal was. The other thing that we noticed, we used a little bit of the ADNI data set, and other people have done this too, that it was with the ApoE4 allele, which is like the strongest sporadic risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, that tau and phosphorylated tau was related more, or there was a higher rates in females with ApoE4 and not in males. And so to me, that also suggests, the basic research seems to suggest that there's underlying neuropathological differences, neuroplasticity differences, connectivity differences, and they might all, end up in similar spots in terms of, neurogenesis, but that the treatment might have to be really different. And so if we're thinking of Alzheimer's disease as this monolith disease, we might have failed a lot of the time to find a good therapeutic because we're not considering sex and gender, and I'll leave the gender part to the other folks on the call, but it's a really important piece of the puzzle, and I don't think we're going to get very far until we address it.
Thank you, Lisa. Yeah. This is a huge topic in the context of precision medicine as we talk about it, but also the drug development and mechanism of disease. It's like it's a gold mine if you look at it. I'm trying to convince people that this is not a disturbance in your data. It's actually a gold mine of opportunities. I'm looking at Wendy and Stefania to see if they want to add anything. Who wants to go?
Can I jump in? Because
Please.
this so what question, Maria Teresa, really resonates with me. A lot of my work is at this intersection between research and policy. And maybe it's not asked in those terms, so what? But it's often claimed that, okay, there might be some issues there might be some differences, but we don't really know what to do about them. The evidence is not quite there yet. And I profoundly disagree with that. And the work you've put together shows that. This is evidence that I could never marshal at a moment's notice. And I don't think any of us could put together individually. But built together like that, I think it's really overwhelming to anyone who engages with it. I challenge any expert, any policymaker, no matter how much experience they have, to read through this book and not learn 100 new things. Yeah. So do we know everything? Absolutely not. I think every chapter ends with recommendations for further research. But we know enough to act. I really believe that. We know more than enough to make moves in the right direction. So to me, this book is exactly what you need for advocacy, exactly what you need to bring to policymakers. Every time you're told, well, we don't quite know enough. We know enough. Yeah, we know enough. We don't know everything. And hopefully you'll help us get there. But I really believe this. It's time to act.
Fantastic, Stefania. I'm very happy to hear that, because one of our goals was to create a resource, something that people could use in their research, in their studies, in their practice, and maybe also for policy. So this is very rewarding for us.
Yeah, I'll have to buy 20 to 50 copies and bring them to me to every meeting, and worst comes to worst, just throw them at policymakers, whatever works. But yeah, it's definitely a great resource for me.
Thank you. And Wendy,
yeah,
how would you like to close this?
I couldn't agree more, really. I mean, I think, for me, I think, we're from an advocacy organization, and we're all about sort of implementation research. So it's all about, you guys are the real hardcore scientists that are in there working away, and we're just shouting about it, So for me, it was so exciting to be part of this. And Stefania, you're so right. It's this whole thing about, here is this is like a building block, isn't it? And I didn't even know you guys were doing another book, so it's brilliant, because this is the building block that's going to continue, and almost the reference point at this moment, and it's just going to continue, because I think the big thing for policymakers is that they just want proof, and if you can show them the proof and show them how they can actually sort of save money by making some changes, by doing precision medicine, by diagnosing people in a timely way so that you can actually help them to live better while their disease progresses, so that they don't go into crisis. In the long term, you're going to save money, and you're also going to make life better for people. So for me, I feel like this is, like you say, Stefania, this is going to be a reference book that I'll be able to use and point people towards. We'll just have to figure out a way of bringing it electronically, so we don't have to throw it at them,
Thank you, Wendy. Okay, that was really great. And I'm sure people have a lot of questions. So I think it's time to open the discussion also to our audience and participants. And I'll let Anne-Marie Schumacher-Dimech lead this part of the webinar.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our speakers for the very interesting and exciting insights. I invite you to submit your questions in our Q&A section. I would like to start with a general question about the book. So perhaps this is more for you, Maria Teresa. And Caroline Schmidt asked, is the book structured like a textbook or a collection of the most important publications available until point of publication?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's actually a textbook. It's divided in these 3 sections. In every section you have quite a few chapters, and every chapter gives an overview of the evidence in the field with, of course, all the references, but it's really a textbook the way it's built.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have another, I'll try to be as fast as I can because I can see the questions are coming in. And Petronella Sandulash, she asks, what can we do as women to protect our brains from developing Alzheimer? Any preventive measures?
I can give you my little acronym for whenever I get asked this question. I came up with DRESS. So people might need to help me a little. Diet, reduce stress, exercise, social support, and sleep. Those are I'd say that all of those have the best, sort of best evidence for preventative care, and I like DRESS, right? But one of my colleagues here at, it's not Alzheimer's disease, it's Parkinson's disease, but she just shared with me a publication she has looking at the MIND diet for Parkinson's disease, and in women specifically, women adhere to diets better than men do. That might not be a surprise to the audience, but even when you take that into account, she found that a MIND diet improved symptoms for I think 12 years in Parkinson's disease for women, and 7 years. It still improved for men. I think it was 7 years in men, but that suggests to me that the diet option might even be more important for women's brain health and in men's brain health. It's important for both. Men don't mess up, but all of those things have very good evidence to support your brain health, and start early. Earlier the better.
Wendy.
That again, I tried to write it down fast. I love that so much. I'm going to use that. DRESS. Say it again. Diet,
reduce stress, exercise, social support, and sleep. I'm glad you're going to use it. I was proud of myself for coming up with that. Do it, use it.
Thank you, Lisa. Any other tips from our speakers? If not, I'll just move on to the next question from Marilyn Labasque. And she asks, do you take inspiration from other fields also addressing sex and gender differences? And she's thinking about, for example, treatment of infectious diseases.
Well, so I didn't want to jump in again, but it's getting a revision from a journal, but we looked at neuroscience and psychiatry, and we didn't see a lot of, like I said, not a lot of studies are analyzing by sex. So I'd even see for treatment of infectious diseases, you can see that with COVID-19 and our pandemic right now, you don't see a lot of uptake of sex and gender analyses or even data. So I really appreciate Wendy's statements too, but we really need good data. So I think the better field is probably cardiovascular health. I don't know if you guys would agree.
And if you allow me, cardiovascular, I'm very passionate about this because they have been spearheading the topic of gender medicine, and I'm convinced that's because of data. That's because they had the Framingham heart study with thousands of data that they could analyze and they could come up with evidence. So I'm totally in line with you saying that we need the data, and in other fields they're much farther down the road. We have to learn.
I'm sure that's a thank you from Rhoda Au, who co-wrote the chapter here, which has been spearheading that continuation of the Framingham data, which is just a gold mine in terms of memory.
Thank you. There is another question from Marilyn Labasque, and I think it's a question I often get as well, related to my work within Women's Brain Project. What are the barriers across the scientific community in adopting gender and sex perspectives more seriously? What is your experience?
Well, I can add, sort of adds on to what I was saying. I think that we don't have the norms again, and that we do have to have different norms in late life as we did in youth, and that should be a standard. And it's just so interesting that it hasn't been. That said, now it's now difficult, again, we need population data for this. It's difficult to sort of suddenly catch up on 50 years of not having norms. Especially, it's not just the norms, it's at what point should we start, restart the big sex difference. Do we start at 30? Do we start at 45? What about 60? Stuff like that. So I think that's definitely for us one of the big differences and struggle is to now put this into action and really come up with how should we be doing this. A lot of times, some of us know, you co-vary sex. It's like, that's not the same thing statistically, as opposed to really having the two populations and two samples differently. So I don't know if that completely answers it, but from my perspective, clinically, I think that's a really, really big issue that we need to rethink and I think start putting into action as a norm going forward, to not co-vary sex, to separate it out, to really look at these things differently. So I don't know if.
Yeah, thank you, Nancy.
Can I add something? And it's a bit of a different perspective because it doesn't look at the medical research community. But I think in the social policy, social sciences community, there's sometimes a bit of a knee-jerk reaction against suggestions to very specifically focus on women as opposed to men. That comes from a misunderstanding of the term inequality and inequity. This idea that we might be perpetuating inequality by separating men from women and treating them as different groups rather than one common human model. And again, this is a bad misunderstanding because to treat people equitably, you need to correctly understand the differences rather than pretend that we are all identical in this very ill-defined superficial way. So not sure to what extent that really applies for medical research, but I'd really like to move past this really basic understanding of what it is we want to say when we say equality, gender equity, and the importance of understanding and recognizing differences.
Comment is so right on target. I think that's completely true. And I think that goes into what I was trying to say too, which is why people haven't accepted the separate norms. It's just impossible, people just don't want to do it. And, lectures that I've been giving and stuff like that, when I say to them, but we do it in kids, we don't think boys and girls, what point does it stop? It's not necessarily the right comparison, but there certainly everybody does accept that boys and girls are different. And I just think, socially, and I think your point is absolutely right on. How do you convince people to do that?
Wendy?
I'm also going to add, and I completely agree with everything you guys have said. And I don't know which one of you at a previous lecture, it might have been you, Maria Teresa, had mentioned that sometimes, it's research into, clinical trials and that thing is women were considered too messy because of, all the hormonal issues and all of that. It was too complicated. So let's just keep it just the same, which is, ridiculous. And I can't help but think, if there was a condition where the majority of men were impacted by it and at a risk factor, et cetera, that there would be a complete flip in the focus and spending on that disease, as opposed to this. And I think, everything you just said, Nancy and Stefania is absolutely right, that it's not bad to separate and look at this. We need to know more and understand more so we can make some changes.
Thank you. Thank you. I know this hour has flown by, but I hope you will allow me to read out one last question, because I think it's also a very important and pertinent question. And it's about ethnical differences. So any ethnical differences within the women's population when it comes to Alzheimer's disease? I see speakers nodding. Who would like to go first?
Well, I do know that, I think that what we found when we were researching sort of, women's involvement in clinical trials, that there was a huge disparity between, women not being involved, but also women from minority groups and women of color haven't been encouraged and facilitated to get involved in some of the clinical trials, which is seen as a huge gap in And I hope that is sort of response to the question, but it's one of the things that we saw when we were researching our chapter.
Yeah, I think unfortunately it's not just to women, it's to men too. And I think it's generally things that we have to, and some of the field obviously is addressing differences from Alzheimer's disease to head trauma to all sorts of brain diseases, and looking at that generally. And it is a huge, very, very important question, and a huge lack of what going forward, and something that we need to be including all the time, not just some of the time. These data sets that are predominantly white are just unacceptable now. You know, I mean, I know Annie being one of them and stuff like that, but it doesn't tell the story. You know, and we're missing huge parts. And I'm worried too that it's telling the wrong story. So that's the other piece of having just, you know, a uniform, too much of a uniformity, and we have to really look at the good part of the diversity, really understanding it.
Thank you.
Can I add
Yes.
one thing to that? Because I think it does open the door to a really, really important point. We've tried very much in our chapter to cover evidence from high and lower and middle income countries, which really becomes a very frustrating exercise. The overwhelming majority of what we know, especially on ethnicity, race, unfortunately comes from the US. So that was part of why we excluded it as one dimension of inequality that we could have added to the mix. But even on gender and socioeconomic status, the vast majority of evidence we have comes from higher income countries. And that is a huge limitation, and absolutely the frontier researchers should explore. And hopefully there are some research funders on this call, or some grant makers that can invest a bit more in expanding geographically and increasing diversity in the kinds of studies we run.
Yes, thank you for this important point. I wonder if we have time for one more question. What do you think, Maria Teresa? Can I go ahead? Because this is another topic that we have covered in the book, and it's about clinical trials or participation in clinical trials. And the question is, are women scared to take part in clinical trials due to future fertility concerns? Is that true? Is that a real factor when it comes to participation? I think Maria Teresa, or Lisa, yeah.
Lisa.
Well, this is the one I probably know least about, but I think it's more of a concern of being compensated for time. So, you know, often younger women will have a lot of duties and the childcare duties and things like that. And I think and I believe that a lot of clinical trials are during working hours, and so that also limits. But you know, it's a question that a lot of researchers that are doing patient populations are thinking about, but I don't know that we have all of the answers to it. To try to get over those barriers. Same thing with, I'm sure, with ethnicity as well. Maria, you were going to say something.
Yeah, just to comment, our experience has been more with clinical trials of Alzheimer's disease in sporadic cases. So we are looking at an older population, so I can't really comment on the fertility part. But what we found in our latest study was that actually there is a lower number of women involved in clinical trials than you would expect based on the percentages of the women in the AD population. So we are suspecting that there might be issues in recruiting and so enrolling and keeping women in clinical trials for Alzheimer's disease. And this is similar to what happens in stroke. So we are discussing with the colleagues from, again, learning from cardiovascular, what could it be? And their barriers are more related to like something like what Lisa was alluding to, is more really how to manage your day, especially if you're a widow, if you don't have a caregiver. You know, these are very long and time consuming and complicated clinical trials. So that might be one of the issues that for women, maybe they don't have a caregiver and it's much harder to be part of it. We don't have numbers yet. And actually I would really, really love to have a dedicated study to this. Not easy, but stay tuned.
Actually, can I share something I learned in another Women's Brain Project event from someone who knew what they were talking about? That women are more likely to enroll and to be retained in clinical studies that are led by female PIs.
I guess.
And this might have to do with trust. It might have to do with how comforted they are, how the proposition of participating in the trial is presented to them. It might have to do with the way women PIs design their studies, with an understanding of what are the daily requirements of a woman's life. But I found that extremely revealing, that potentially the issue is not with the women, but with the trials.
Yes, Wendy?
Because you and I must have been sitting next to each other at one of those forums. And what I learned is that actually I think it was a migraine clinical trial, that women of childbearing age were actually taken out because they didn't want to test the drugs on women who were, and so again, like you say, Stefania, that, you know, it wasn't necessarily the women who were pulling themselves out, it was the companies themselves that were doing the research. So, and that was actually seen as a huge problem, because they didn't know how, you know, that by pulling the women out, it actually cut them out of access to those drugs at that point. So that had an impact on them as well. So yeah, we learned from that.
So attend our next forum is the key message here, and you will learn a lot about about clinical trials and other related themes. Before wrapping up and handing over the concluding remarks to Maria Teresa, I'm seeing some questions from people who are interested in doing a PhD research on one of the topics. What I suggest is that you get in touch with us at info@womensbrainproject.com. We have various projects in the pipeline, or projects that are already happening. So maybe if there's a match, you know, there would be a possibility of collaborating. And also there was another question about who the book is written for, if it's for a general audience or for a targeted audience. Well, the book is a textbook, so we have a large or a wide audience for this book, ranging from students or persons interested in this topic, all the way to scientists who are working in the field. Of course, for some chapters, you may need some scientific background to read through the chapters, but I think it's even for someone who is not an expert, you know, an AD expert, I think it's a very, very good read. I don't know if any one of the speakers or Maria Teresa would like to add on this. Okay, so Maria Teresa, are there any concluding remarks from your side?
Well, I just to say that this has been extremely inspiring and insightful discussion, and I would be able to sit here with you and talk for days, but unfortunately we cannot continue. I think we have really put together a lot of good arguments for how many of these sex differences exist and how important they are for everybody. So I'm very glad that we discussed that. And so I don't really have any specific concluding remarks, but I would really like to thank everybody, and starting from the people joining this call today, the authors that joined the webinars, but all the other authors that could not join, and the team at WBP at large, because I have to tell you, this has been really a team effort, and it would have not been possible without the team that it's behind us. So I just want to say a huge thank you to everybody, including the team at Elsevier who supported us. And with that, Anne-Marie, I think I would pass to you for...
Yes, thank you, Maria Teresa. And maybe if you could share the final slide. I would also like to join Maria Teresa with saying a big thank you to our speakers and to all our authors who worked with us, and the Women's Brain Project team. It was an amazing experience. And answer also some questions from the audience, yes, you can join us, and we encourage you and invite you to join us. You can join us as members, as individual members. You can join us as an organization with a corporate membership. Please follow us on social media. We are active on Twitter, on Instagram, on LinkedIn, on Facebook, also on YouTube. So wherever you go, you'll find us. Just click on follow, and you'll get regular news from us. Visit our website for more information, and via our website you can also find out more about how to become members or volunteers with Women's Brain Project. And of course, as I mentioned earlier on, most of us, the majority of the team, works on a pro bono basis. We rely on sponsors and other donations to conduct our work and do our own research and events. So we are always grateful for any help that helps us reach our goals and reach as many people as possible. So many thanks to all of you who joined us this evening. Thank you for joining us. We hope to keep in touch, and many thanks to everyone. And I wish you all a lovely evening or a lovely afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.